This was pre-planned, premeditated, 5 months in advance, and it was initially timed to take place on the Gurpurab of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, which falls in the first week of November. But obviously that planned genocide was brought forward.
Alright, what's going on everyone? Welcome back to another Ramblings of a Sikh podcast. Today's topic of discussion is the November 1984 anti-Sikh genocide. This topic is not only dear to Sikhs around the world, but is also perhaps one of the most misunderstood periods of human history amongst the general public. This ignorance is fully due to top to bottom government cover-up, the intimidating and unconquerable state ensuring the reality of the events took decades to reach the wider public, and justice, well, there has been almost none. Today I get to sit with Pav Singh,
Thank you for having me.
author of 1984 India's Guilty Secret, and discuss a whole range of questions including how his own family was impacted by the events of 1984. If Indira Gandhi had not been assassinated, had the events of November 1st to November 3rd taken place? How and why did things come to an end on November 3rd? Naming those who are responsible, starting with those right at the top. And not to forget, we also question and look at the extent to which the British government helped the Indian government during 1984. We obviously discuss a whole range of other questions, and there's a lot that you will hopefully learn from this, so please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and watch this right to the end. Now let's get straight into it. So if you don't mind, could you possibly tell us a little bit about your family's upbringing and history and where you kind of fit into all of that?
Sure. So I was actually born in Yorkshire, in Leeds, but my parents are from the Punjab, of Sikh background. So my dad actually came over in 1962, actually from Singapore. So he was in Singapore for the duration of the war, and then after the war, he got married and then brought his wife, my mother, over, and my older brother as well, who was born in Singapore. So they all three came over, and then settled in Leeds of all places. So my dad actually, although he was a bit of a businessman in Singapore, over here he did quite hard work in terms of building sites, and he did work in scaffolding. And my mum was a seamstress, so working in the textile industry in Leeds. So yeah, I was born in 1966, but coming in 84, I think I was 17 years old. So the actual day of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination and what took place afterwards is still vivid in my memory, especially particularly the morning of the 31st. So I'm very familiar with the events. I also have my maternal aunt who was based in Delhi at the time. My aunt Masi and my Masad and four cousins, they were all based in Delhi. So managed to get first-hand accounts from them following 1984 with my frequent visits to India. So yeah, that's pretty much my background. I went to university down in London, and I basically stayed down south. But it was really during my university days that became quite political, in terms of what was going on here. We still had the apartheid system in South Africa, so I was very keenly campaigning against apartheid during the late 80s, marching against the racist government in South Africa, calling for the release of Nelson Mandela. And I am also quite active in the Anti-Nazi League at the time as well. So we had a growth of the BNP at the time, and before that the National Front. So I was quite active against the emergence of fascist organizations who were causing lots of trouble against Black and Asian communities in the late 80s and early 90s. So that was sort of my kind of political background, and I think I was always kind of on the political left at the time. So yeah, that's pretty much where I came from when I faced looking at 1984 in a different way.
Obviously, I'm from a generation that didn't firsthand lived through the events that took place in 1984, and a lot of what we've learned has been passed down through the accounts and the research of the work of obviously like your generation and the generation prior. When you were talking about living through October 31st and November 1st, it kind of sounds similar to like events such as like 9/11, which were kind of world changing. Could you just expand a little bit about actually what you remember from that day itself, in terms of like you obviously woke up and like brushed your teeth or whatever, like as in like I know a lot of people kind of say, do you remember where you were on 9/11 or when Nelson Mandela was released from prison or X, Y, or Z? Like in a similar way, I guess it would definitely be fair to say this is a comparable event.
Most definitely. And I think particularly 1984, there was a build up to the events of November. So you had the shock of June 1984. And I think that was a real shock to the Sikh psyche, not only in India, but also the world. The, invasion of the Golden Temple by Indian army troops, and the massacre that took place. So there was a big shock already that was there. And Sikhs around the world, and particularly in Britain, there was a major march in London that I still remember my mum talking about at the time. So there was a deep hurt within the Sikh community already approaching October 31st. But October 31st, I still remember I was getting ready to go to school. I was in sixth form. Um, and yeah, the TV was on. We knew straight away what happened. We were quite shocked, actually. So there was a few hours of real shock, and then slowly, when the news started repeating that it was two Sikhs who had killed Mrs. Gandhi in revenge of what happened in June, it sort of dawned on people slowly that this wasn't good for the Sikh minority in India. Nothing was going to come good of this. But I think we were quite surprised in the next few years how that retaliation took place. How is it that for the act of just two Sikhs in killing Mrs. Gandhi, the whole Sikh community in India were blamed for that assassination? So that sort of deep hatred that sort of started developing from early on in 1984 sort of permeated in all sections of Indian society. And I think that was the big surprise for us, particularly, in relation to who was involved from the top, also who was involved at the bottom as well. Um, so it wasn't so clear cut, but it was only years later that a fuller picture emerged of what actually happened, not only the organization, but also in terms of neighbors actually turning upon their neighbors, which was quite a shock for us.
So, just kind of two things off the back of that. And I think one thing that is often retold when it comes to this narrative is that the assassination and then the events that took place are intrinsically linked, as though if the assassination hadn't taken place, there wouldn't have been the response. Like, to what extent is that true? Because obviously, when you read your book, it's very clear that there is really serious planning that takes place. And anyone who kind of looks at the bigger picture would assume that you can't really plan something on such a scale so quickly. So, to what extent is the assassination and the response linked, and in what way does it work?
So people at the time, particularly human rights groups, documented some of the organization that took place, but it was only 30 years later that the real truth emerged in terms of pre-planning months in advance. So we do have evidence now from a person who worked as a civil servant in the government, who has said that 5 months before, lists were compiled from the gurdwaras in Delhi of Sikh homes and businesses, and they were also used school rations lists as well. And this came right from the top, from someone who was part of the Gandhi Nehru family, Arun Nehru MP, who was involved in organizing those. So we can actually now look at actually this was pre-planned, premeditated, 5 months in advance, and it was initially timed to take place on the Gurpurab of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, which falls in the first week of November. But obviously, with the assassination that took place on the 31st of October, that planned genocide was brought forward. Also, running the weeks towards 31st of October, there's lots of evidence, eyewitness accounts of people being warned that this was going to take place. People told to take their children out because the timing of the 1st of November was set as soon as the assassination had happened, that this would take place, and the mobs would have 3 days free reign of Delhi and outskirts of Delhi in northern India, where Congress was in power. They would have 3 days to exact revenge on the Sikh community. So yeah, there's lots of merging evidence that it was definitely pre-planned. There was, even if you look at the logistics of what took place, the availability of kerosene, which isn't available to the average man on the street, the availability of the white phosphorus chemical powder, which you can't procure unless there's organization behind it, which was used to burn its victims to the bone. The use of the buses, the unauthorized train stoppages that took place throughout northern India to seek out Sikhs on railways. There's so much, and obviously the list distribution of the lists as well, the marking of Sikh houses on the 31st of October, and also when the killings had taken place, there was a big operation which involved the police to dispose of the evidence, dispose of the bodies. So there was trucks and trucks coming out of Delhi to the outskirts of Delhi. There was mass cremations that were taking place. So yeah, it's a heavily organized event that can only take place months before, in order to make sure that the count was in the thousands, not in the hundreds.
So it's pretty fair to say that had the assassination hadn't taken place, something was being planned, and the fact that this assassination took place provided not the excuse, but it just brought things forward.
Yeah. So the reason why I mentioned June 84 is really important, because what took place in June, and then from June till November, there was a heightened tension. There was, there was a feeling in Indian society generally that even though, Sikhs been dealt a heavy blow in June 84, the job hadn't been done. Sikhs needed to be taught a lesson um, for the turmoil that they were blamed for what was taking place in the Punjab, the killings of Hindus in Punjab permeated into outright hatred towards the whole Sikh community. I don't want to go into too much detail of what was happening in Punjab. It was very political. There were various different groups, some groups backed by the state, some groups on their own. There were innocent Hindus killed. There's lots of Sikh leaders who were condemning what was taking place. There was a real wedge being drawn between Sikhs and Hindus by political forces for their own ends by all parties. But I think that was then permeated into Indian society, who just looked at what was happening in Punjab and blamed Sikhs en masse. So that propaganda helped and laid the ground for such a killing spree to take place.
One thing that you mentioned as you recounted the events that unfolded on October 31st / November 1st and kind of what you remember, you comment about how the bigger picture didn't come to light for, obviously, as you said, almost over 30 years. Now, How does your research tie into that? So obviously you said that you had kind of a personal connection because you already had family that firsthand experienced this, and obviously were able to tell you their, well, maybe not depending on the trauma, but obviously to some extent they were able to tell you what took place. But then in terms of kind of your research and your trips to India, could you please kind of expand on like how, as your research developed, a bigger picture came together and then I guess eventually accumulated into your book?
Yeah, sure. And I think one of the other things about why I'd started on this path was also my political background when I was at university. So for me to stand up against racism in South Africa, against fascist organizations in this country, fighting for equal rights for gays and so forth, I then started to look at actually my own community and what happened in '84 and why nothing had been done about it. And then just looking at the way the official narrative around 1984, the so-called anti-Sikh riots, how it's been framed, um, really, I think, dealt a really powerful um, force in, writing what happened in '84. And it was written, the history of '84 at that time was written by the perpetrators who called it a riot, a spontaneous reaction to Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. So I really wanted to investigate and then redress that narrative. And that took me to India in 2005. So I've got family out there. My master took me to some of the colonies, particularly Dalak Vihar and Dalak Nagar, visiting some of the survivors and some of the horror stories that I heard. And he plainly told me that his local MP was involved. His local MP in West Delhi was Sajjan Kumar, the only MP who's been charged out of the scores of MPs and cabinet ministers, but he's the only one who's been charged. But that took 30 years. Um, but yeah, absolutely, there was plain sight from my family's, um, um, eyewitness accounts that this was organised, particularly on the 31st of October, in terms of bringing the mobs together and then executing that on the first of November. Um, so every time I went back to India, I kept hearing more stories. And then when I went to Punjab, where I lived for a year, I heard the other stories that were taking place post November '84. What was took place in Punjab with the army, um, and the human rights violations that took place for a whole 10 years, where the state really went after, um, on the pretext of going after the militants, went after families and innocents. And then you had the case of the cremations that took place that just Vance in Cholera uncovered. So there's a whole history there as well that sort of tied in with what was taking place after '84 in Delhi and other places, and the injustice um, for 30 years, more, nearly 40 years now, of the survivors, where there has been absolutely no justice for them.